I get my sound up. Now I'm good. There we go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Philipse Manor Hall's monthly historic presentation. I'm your host tonight, and also your presenter at the same time. I'm Michael Lord. I'm the site director here at Philipse Manor Hall, so I'm thrilled to have you here. And for those of you playing at home, I'm thrilled to have you guys taking a look today, even though I heard that there's some kind of sports thing going on tonight. I don't know. Anyway, for the semi-quincentennial, which is what we're celebrating right now, we're taking a deep dive into the American Revolution. Sit back, take notes if you guys are so inclined. And also, if you've got questions, we're going to have some time at the end of this conversation as well to chat. And also, if you are online, there will be a chat box, and you can also submit your questions there, and I'd be glad to talk to you about that as well. Tonight's presentation, as you can see, is George versus Guy, the fate of the Black Loyalists. The George we're talking about is none other than George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. That's him there on the left. And the Guy on the right is Sir Guy Carleton. He's the Commander-in-Chief of British North America. At the end of the war, as the British were fighting forces and they were packing up and leaving the new United States of America, these two men clashed over how their interpretations of a single article in the Paris Peace Treaty played out and affected the lives of more than 3,500 or so Black Loyalists. So I'm going to start with some of those stories to kind of get an understanding of what all this is. Now, first of all, she was 15 years old when she fled. We don't know if she left her family or if she even had family. What we do know is that it was often unsafe for a young enslaved woman to be under the supervision of a male enslaver. In 1777, Eleanor Fleming left the whitewashed stone manor house in Sleepy Hollow that was known as the Upper Mills. The house and the land belonged to Frederick Philipse III and was leased to William Pugsley for about £200 a year. Since, 15 years earlier, Pugsley had supervised the milling and the farming operation of Phillips's Upper Mills property. Eleanor Fleming fled, heading south, perhaps by foot, or maybe even she caught a sloop carrying her down towards New York City. That same year, Samuel Doran had been given permission by his enslaver to sail on a galley down the Hudson River to New York. While on board, Doran was said to have somehow or another gotten off board and taken his two young children named Peter and Elizabeth from Van Cortlandt Manor in Croton and brought them on board this British ship headed for Manhattan. And a year earlier, in 1776, an enslaved man named Harry left the Virginia plantation of his enslaver, George Washington. Harry self-liberated, finding his way south to join Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment and take up arms against his enslaver and the American rebels. In time, Harry Washington, Samuel Doran, and Eleanor Fleming all found their way to New York City, where they spent years living in the British-occupied city. After the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, however, it was clear that the new United States would win their independence from Great Britain. I'm sorry if I spoiled that for anybody. All right? What happened to the self-liberated men, women, and children who had found refuge from their patriot enslavers in British-occupied New York now that the British were packing up and preparing to leave the city in defeat? So let's walk this back just a little bit to understand some of the issues and the events leading up to the stories of Eleanor and Samuel and Harry. Now, by 1770, slavery was well established and legal in all 13 colonies. The first of those colonies to legally recognize people as property was, anybody from the galley here? Virginia, right, Massachusetts. Massachusetts in 1641 was the first to legalize enslavement out of these colonies. How about the last colony to legalize slavery in the 13 colonies? Yeah, that's a tougher one, but Georgia kind of flips the story when we're thinking about slavery here in the North American colonies, with the North kind of starting it and then the South kind of filling in later on. It's kind of interesting to think of it that way. Now, slavery as a permanent and inheritable form of labor was legal, frankly, in every European colony in the Western Hemisphere at this time, from Canada all the way down to Chile. By 1770, New York City's population hovered around 18,000 people or so. It was second in size to Philadelphia. The enslaved in Manhattan numbered about 3,000, so about 1/3 of the population. Well, actually, but yeah, 1/6 of the population, I'm a historian, not a mathematician, was enslaved. Not only were the numbers of enslaved individuals increasing, the numbers of enslavers were also growing throughout the northern and southern colonies. And although ownership in human property was legal and growing under British authority, the constitutionality of slavery in Great Britain was about to be tested with what became known as the Somerset case. James Somerset was an African-born man taken from his home and sold into slavery when he was around 8 years old. A Scottish merchant living in Virginia named Charles Stewart purchased the child in 1749. In 1764, Stewart relocated to Boston, taking Somerset with him, and about 5 years later, Stewart left Boston and the colonies and took Somerset with him to London, where they had lived, or where they started living for a few years there. Stewart used Somerset to run errands. This allowed Somerset to get to know the city and its residents. And while in London, Somerset fell in with a small but growing group of abolitionists and a community of free blacks and enslaved that was estimated to number between 15 and 20,000. This is a big city, London was. In the fall of 1771, Somerset left Stewart and refused to return to a state of permanent servitude. Stewart then promptly kidnapped Somerset and had him taken to a ship awaiting transport to Jamaica, where he was going to be sold to a sugar planter. Somerset was placed under the custody of the ship's captain, John Knowles. Meanwhile, because this story really needs a meanwhile, Somerset's abolitionist friends appealed to the court that Somerset was being detained illegally. And by early December 1771, Somerset was in court, along with Captain Knowles, who was accused of illegally holding Somerset. The Chief Justice presiding over this case was William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield. We'll call him Lord Mansfield, just to shorten that up. Mansfield was the equivalent of our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, so he was the top dog in England at that time. Somerset, likely due to his abolitionist friends, was able to secure Granville Sharp, an anti-slavery activist, to advise in his case. Now, essentially, the case is pretty simple. Lord Mansfield was asked to determine whether Somerset had the right to remain in England, or whether his enslaver, John Stewart, had the right to send him to Jamaica. It wasn't until June of 1772, 8 months later actually, that the case Somerset versus Stewart was decided. Mansfield's decision was narrow yet profound. Mansfield's judgment stated simply, I'm going to quote him here, "It," meaning slavery, "is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from this decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged." Mansfield's court unanimously concluded that Charles Stewart, Somerset's enslaver, had no right to forcibly take and carry him abroad. Although Lord Mansfield made an effort to keep this ruling very narrow and focused only on Somerset's case, it still changed the way enslavement was defined in the eyes of the court. See, in England, Somerset's case was immediately seen as a test of slavery's legality. The trial and its outcome were closely followed in England and throughout the British Empire. An enslaved man who can freely choose to remain in England against his enslaver's wishes had certain human and civil rights in the eyes of the court, not simply considered property. Mansfield's ruling was embraced by England, their emerging abolitionist campaign, where they posed a simple question. If slavery in its fullest extent could not be legal in England, why was it still legal in England's colonies? And that means us, the 13 over here. Somerset's case was widely reported in colonial newspapers. It was debated and discussed amongst wealthy planters and local politicians here in the colonies. And more important, it was debated and discussed within the barracks, the basements, and the outbuildings inhabited by the enslaved community as well. In June of 1774, the Virginia Gazette ran an ad, a lot less blurry than the ad that's up here, but they ran an ad for an enslaved man named Bacchus. His enslaver, who placed the ad, noted that Bacchus, it's down here at the bottom here, will probably endeavor to pass for a free man by the name of John Christian and attempt to get on board some vessel bound for Great Britain from the knowledge he has of the late determination of Somerset's case. Word simply gets across the ocean, and people are beginning to act on this notion that maybe there's freedom in England that there isn't here in the colonies. For the enslaved community, Somerset kind of laid the groundwork for believing that England, not the colonies, provided the best opportunity for freedom. Now, less than 3 years after the Somerset case was decided, Massachusetts militia and British regulars had fired on each other in skirmishes at Lexington and at Concord, resulting in a war for independence that lasted 8 long years. The American Revolution was many things. It was a tax revolt, it was a debate over good government and consent, it was a revolution against a monarchy, but it was also a civil war between colonial Americans, their families, their neighbors, and their friends. To help galvanize those who had committed to one side or the other, or to help recruit those still on the fence, both sides practiced a war of propaganda played out in pamphlets, newspapers, editorials, public gatherings, church sermons, tavern debates. Patriotic propaganda often used the rhetoric of slavery to make their point against the tyranny of the king. The colonies said that they were slaves to the king or to Parliament because they were not free to make their own decisions. So as early as 1768, Samuel Adams, wrong Samuel Adams, wrote, as a response to the Sugar Act, he wrote, "If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without ever having a legal representative where they are laid, are we not reduced from characters of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slavery?" That same year, a prominent Philadelphia lawyer and a patriot named John Dickinson wrote in response to the Townshend Acts, "Those who are taxed without their own consent or their own representatives are slaves. We are taxed without our own consent or our representatives. We are, therefore, slaves." Now, the irony of owning men calling for liberty and freedom against a tyrannical government and oppressing them as slaves was not lost on the crown. In his 1774 treatise, treatise was Taxation, No Tyranny, British writer, philosopher Samuel Johnson famously sneered at these American slave owners about talking about slavery when they themselves are owning the enslaved. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty amongst the drivers of negroes? At the start of the American Revolution, there were about 2.5 million residents in the 13 colonies, and 1 out of every 5 were enslaved. Yeah. The 500,000 enslaved men, women, and children made difficult choices during the war based on what would be most beneficial to themselves and their families. Most often, this meant siding with the British, partially because of the after effects of the Somerset case, but also because the British were the first to make overtures of freedom to the enslaved as the war began. Let's talk about that first overture. On the 7th of November, 1775, 6 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and a full 8 months before the Declaration of Independence, Lord Dunmore, Virginia's royal governor, published a proclamation. This is known as the Dunmore Proclamation. It promised freedom to any enslaved man owned by a rebel who could make his way to occupied British territory and take up arms against their former enslaver. Thousands of enslaved men ran to join Dunmore's fighting force. They were given weapons, they were drilled for combat, and on their uniform shirt was written the words, "Liberty to slaves." They were known as Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And as a fighting force, frankly, they weren't all that effective because Lord Dunmore had lost control of Virginia at this point. He was kind of running his operation on a ship anchored offshore near the mouth of the York River. And the Ethiopian Regiment lived in very squalid conditions on marshy land nearby, so dysentery, typhoid fever, and eventually even smallpox kind of decimated, really, the regiment. But as a propaganda tool, Dunmore's proclamation was wildly successful. First, it scared the bejeebers out of the slaveholding population in every colony. Dunmore's proclamation was designed as a weapon of terror, a weapon that has been used as far back, as you can see, as Greek and Roman times, with the thought of an army of formerly enslaved men fighting against their enslavers. Second, it showed the enslaved population that Britain, not the American rebels, offered a pathway to freedom. Dunmore's proclamation was a far better offer than the Continental Army. General George Washington initially had banned enslaved men from serving in the military completely. A significant number of representatives to the Second Continental Congress were also opposed to arming slaves and slave owners, while slave owners themselves were reluctant to lose members of their labor force to the military. Free persons of color could join on the Continental side, and in 1778, Rhode Island took advantage of this loophole for allowing free men of color to join by offering to purchase the freedom of any enslaved man who wished to join Washington's army, provided, of course, that they had their enslavers' permission. This formed the basis of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, an integrated regiment that was present at nearly every major battle during the war. About 140 free men of color served in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, making up about 2/3 of the regimental soldiers. By comparison, though, Dunmore's proclamation motivated thousands of enslaved men to run towards British-occupied territory. Less than a year after issuing his proclamation, Lord Dunmore had lost total control of Virginia, and he sailed north to safety of Staten Island, which was under British control. The ragtag remnants of the Ethiopian regiment left with him and were reformed into the Loyalist Black Brigade. Harry Washington basically traveled south to join the Ethiopian regiment down in Tidewater, Virginia. Now, Harry Washington left George Washington's plantation in 76, and when he headed down there, he soon found himself having to relocate up to New York with the rest of the Ethiopian regiment and Lord Dunmore. Eleanor Fleming and Samuel Doran and his 2 children all left their enslavers from Westchester County down to the city. And in every single British-occupied coastal city, thousands found their way to British-occupied cities of Charleston and Savannah, New York City, and other places. Historians estimate somewhere between 20 and 80,000 enslaved men or individuals in general left their enslavers to find safety behind British lines. In the summer of 1779, Dunmore's proclamation was broadened by Sir Henry Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in North America. Now, this proclamation became known as the Philipsburg Proclamation, and it was issued right here at Philipse Manor Hall, right where I'm standing, right where you're sitting. It was issued right on this property. The document, Clinton's document, the Philipsburg document, clearly stated, I'm just going to put this out there, I do most strictly forbid any person to sell or claim right over any Negro, the property of a rebel, who may take refuge with any part of this army. And I do promise to every Negro who shall desert the rebel standard full security to follow within these lines any occupation which he shall think property. Those are the words of an Emancipation Proclamation, but issued by a British commander a full 84 years before President Lincoln's. The document offered freedom to any enslaved person, man, woman, or child, enslaved by a rebel, and could make it to British-occupied territory. So there was no military requirement for this, unlike Dunmore's proclamation. It was also listed for all 13 colonies. It wasn't specific to any one colony. So thousands more now escaped, leaving for Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, New York, and those coastal cities under British control. Although free persons of color and enslaved men fought on both sides of the war, more than twice as many chose to side with the British. In many parts of the colonies, home life and daily routines were upended by skirmishes, by battles, by armies traveling through and foraging for food and supplies. The commotion and the chaos caused by war led many enslaved individuals or couples or even entire families to attempt self-liberation. And not surprisingly, runaway advertisements increased during wartime. Enslavers noted some of the motivations their enslaved had for perhaps leaving. Now, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Samuel Hall advertised for the capture of a man named Seneca. Now, Seneca, turns out, carried with him 2 coats, one red, one blue. I wonder why, red and blue coats that he's carrying. And this was one of those advertisements at that time. In May of 1779, the sheriff of Bergen County, New Jersey, advertised that they were holding an unnamed enslaved man from Virginia. The ad noted that the man had deserted his master's service and joined Lord Dunmore upwards of 3 years ago. So the tumultuous nature of life during wartime provided opportunity for many enslaved individuals to leave in search of a new, freer life. Moving forward a little bit, after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781, the British defeat, coinciding with American independence, however implausible that seemed, was now inevitable. The war, however, was not over. Skirmishes continued in the western regions, and the British kept hold of their occupied cities. In the spring of 1782, Sir Henry Clinton, commander-in-chief of His Majesty's his army, was relieved of duty, in large part because of that disastrous loss at Yorktown. So goodbye, Henry. King George then requested that Clinton be replaced with, I'll quote here, "the man who would in general, by the army, be looked on as the best officer." And that best officer was Sir Guy Carleton, the former governor of Quebec and the man who saved Quebec City from capture by the American rebels in 1775. Carleton arrived in New York City in May of 1782 as hostilities were beginning to wind down and as negotiations for a lasting peace treaty were just getting started. As commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces, Guy Carleton entered into a correspondence with his counterpart, George Washington. Both men were tasked, in part, with cleaning up the remnants of the war and organizing a peaceful, just, and expedient departure of British soldiers and naval vessels from the American lands and harbors. From May of 1782 until evacuation of New York in late November 1783, Carleton and Washington exchanged at least 63 letters and even met face-to-face once. Their letters were always respectful, diplomatic, generally cooperative, but they could also be kind of aloof and terse and perhaps even a little passive-aggressive between each other. Taken as a whole, the letters between Carleton and Washington read, not surprisingly, like two parties in the midst of a divorce. And then on the 30th of November, 1782, the Treaty of Paris, the document ending the war formally and recognizing the United States of America as a free and independent nation, was drafted. Now, these are the first and last pages of the document. It's not a very long document. All that remained now were the signatures for the parties involved, and the war would be completely over. But the signing of that treaty didn't occur for another 9 months, not until September of 1783. Now you can see why in this picture. The British delegation were so put out over losing the war, they wouldn't even sit for the portrait, let alone, decide to sign everything over and leave their colonies. The treaty was divided into a preamble and 10 articles. Most of the articles define the rules of peace, recognition of the United States as a sovereign nation, returning captured prisoners of war, and establishing national boundaries and the like. But then there's Article 7. And according to Article 7 of the treaty, there shall be a firm and perpetual peace between His Britannic Majesty and the United States. Wherefore all hostilities, both by sea and land, shall from henceforth immediately cease. All prisoners on both sides shall be set at liberty. And here's the part in question. His Britannic Majesty shall with all convenient speed and without causing any destruction or carrying away any negroes or other property of the American inhabitants, withdraw all his armies, garrisons, and fleets from the said United States and from every port, place, and harbor within the same. When a war ends, it's generally accepted that prisoners are exchanged and that the loser returns any property belonging to the victor. But the notion of returning personal property gets complicated if people are being interpreted as property. For the better part of 6 months, Sir Guy Carleton and George Washington engaged in a legal and moral debate over the status of the formerly enslaved individuals who were promised freedom under the Dunmore and Philipsburg Proclamations. This debate had significant implications for the thousands of men, women, and children of African descent living as free persons in British-occupied cities, Charleston and New York and the like. How were those two opposing interpretations of Article 7 resolved? Correspondence between Washington and Carleton can help parse through some of their opinions anyway. On April the 21st, 1783, George Washington wrote to Guy Carleton proposing a face-to-face meeting. Respecting the other subjects contained in the enclosed resolution of Congress, that's the Treaty of Paris he's writing about, Washington said, "I have to propose a personal interview between Your Excellency and myself at some convenient time and intermediate place, such as may be agreed upon by Your Excellency." 3 days later, Carleton suggested that May 5th would be a good date for a meeting set up in Tappan, across the river, closer to Washington's headquarters. "I cannot decline the personal interview proposed by Your Excellency," he wrote. "If I hear nothing from you to occasion an alteration, I intend being up on the 5th of May. Carleton, though, arrived on the 5th of May, but he was sick with the flu and only met briefly with General Washington the following morning. He then returned to New York immediately after the meeting, still ill and weak with fever. But an account from the May 6th meeting was actually taken by Washington's aides, which is helpful, because the premise of the meeting was to discuss three primary subjects, namely the setting at liberty of the prisoners, those are the POWs, the receiving possessions of posts occupied by British troops, that's basically their evacuation of all the forts and outposts, and 3, obtaining delivery of all Negroes and other property of the inhabitants of these states in possession of His Britannic Majesty. So clearly, the American side does not want to part with these formerly enslaved individuals. Sir Guy Carleton explained that he had been working with the United States Secretary of War to coordinate a prisoner exchange and to speed up the process of evacuating the occupied cities. And Carleton added, though, that upwards of 6,000 persons had already embarked and sailed, and that these embarkations included, quote, a number of Negroes. Washington was a bit surprised. In a letter to Guy Carleton written the same day as the meeting, George Washington makes his case. "In the course of our conference, I was surprised," as he says, "I was surprised to hear you mention that an embarkation had already taken place in which a large number of Negroes had been carried away," wrote the general. "My private opinion is that the measure is totally different from the letter and spirit of the treaty. And I find it my duty to signify my readiness to enter into any agreement to prevent the future carrying away of any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants." So Washington's argument is that Article 7 of the Peace Treaty defined these men, women, and children as still enslaved, and therefore the property of American patriots. Carleton countered Washington's take on Article 7. Carleton had been organizing the evacuation of more than at least 20,000 soldiers and loyalists from New York City since he arrived a year earlier. So when the Articles of Peace were agreed upon, Carleton wasted no time. Even before the treaty was agreed upon in principle, Carleton had already begun moving loyalists off the island. In a letter to Washington dated on May 12th, Carleton noted, here we go, "An embarkation was in much forwardness previous to the official information of peace." Carleton added that there was already an American entourage in New York City inspecting the ships as they left the city. Carleton mentioned that some of the evacuees sailed about the 27th of April for different parts of Nova Scotia and carried about 7,000 persons with all their effects. Carleton enclosed a copy of an order which I had given to prevent the carrying away of any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. But Carleton makes the argument that he would not carry away, quote, Negroes or other property, meaning enslaved individuals. Rather, he would only take Negroes who were freed through the two proclamations. According to the meeting notes, Carleton principally insisted that it could not have been the intention of the British government by the Treaty of Peace to reduce themselves to the necessity of violating their faith to the Negroes who came into British lines under the proclamation of his predecessors in command. That delivering them up to some possible execution and others to severe punishments would be a dishonorable violation of the public faith pledged to the Negroes in the proclamation. Carleton strongly believed that Great Britain must honor the promises of freedom made in the Dunmore and Philipsburg Proclamations, and he would not compromise on this point. So despite losing the war, the fate of Black Loyalists as free men would be protected, at least by Carleton anyway. The Negroes in question, Carleton wrote, "I found free when I arrived at New York. I had therefore no right, as I thought, to prevent their going to any part of the world they thought proper." George Washington saw no room for interpretation in this matter. British wartime promises of freedom for escaped slaves was, in his opinion, voided by their defeat and the recognition of the United States as a sovereign nation. Escaped slaves were chattel property and required, by Washington's opinion, under Article 7 to be returned to their American owners. But even George Washington doubted that American enslavers would ever see their property returned. In a letter to his cousin, Lund Washington, ever heard of a guy named Lund? But anyway, Lund was serving as the steward of Mount Vernon while the general was at war, and Washington wrote his cousin and said, "I have collected enough to convince me that the owners of slaves have very little chance to recover them. Sir Guy puts a very different construction upon the 7th article to what we do, and leave little prospect of recovering the Negroes." Throughout the summer of the fall also of 1783, Washington and Carleton continued to correspond, but discussion about returning enslaved or formerly enslaved persons was conspicuously absent in their letters. Carleton invited Washington to send members of his staff into New York City to inspect how the evacuation was being carried out. Carleton also assigned Brigadier General Samuel Birch to keep detailed records of every Black Loyalist leaving New York with the British. Birch's records became known as the Inspection Roll of Negroes, and they were transcribed into something known as the Book of Negroes. The books were actually written twice, one from the American inspectors and one from the British inspectors. And they're preserved at the National Archives of the United States and also the British National Archives. So you can actually see all of this, which is incredible. Both include the names, the ages, the descriptions, the destinations, the claimants against them, and the former enslavers of them, of more than 3,000 black refugees registered on board the vessels sailing from New York to Nova Scotia between about April to the end of November 1783. Each Black Loyalist permitted to board a ship was issued a note that gave them authorization to leave as a legally free person. Known as a Birch Pass, these small pieces of paper were passports to freedom for the thousands of men, women, and children who had left New York City. Eleanor Fleming, Harry Washington, and Samuel Doran were all entered into Birch's Book of Negroes. By 1783, Fleming had been in New York City for 6 years now. Her entry, like many others, is sparse. The entries actually span 2 pages, and as you read across, you read the various items that they are listed about, their name, their age, how long they've been in the city, who their previous enslaver was. I'm going to enlarge it so you can see. Eleanor Fleming is the 3rd name down. All it says here, she was 21 years old, and she's noted in the book as a stout wench. Birch recorded that she formerly belonged to William Pugsley of Philipse Manor, NYS, New York State. Since 1760, William Pugsley had rented the upper mills of the Sleepy Hollow location owned by Frederick Phillips III. And although Frederick Phillips III himself was a well-known loyalist, it seems that Pugsley's family in Westchester were split on both sides. It's also unclear how many people Pugsley had actually enslaved by the time of the American Revolution. The renter of that site previous to Pugsley was a man named Josiah Martin, and he, according to a 1756 census, had at least 5 enslaved men and 1 woman operating the same site, the farm, the grist mill, and the house. On July 31st, 1783, Fleming left New York City on board the ship the Clinton, bound for Annapolis, which is a small town on the western side of Nova Scotia. And also, the ship also was bound for St. John, today a city in the Canadian province of New Brunswick, but at that point it was still a part of Nova Scotia. Interestingly, in addition to Eleanor Fleming on board the Clinton, there were also 3 other passengers with the last name of Fleming. Samuel Fleming was 20 years old, enlisted, born free, and lived with James Morgan in Valley Forge. Samuel had been in New York since about 1778 or so. There was also 30-year-old Robert Fleming. He was formerly the property of John Holloway of Petersburg, Virginia, and left him 4 years earlier. And also from Virginia was Hannah Fleming. She was 28 and previously enslaved by David McClellan of Norfolk, Virginia. More research is required to determine if there were any family connections with these individuals or if it was just happenstance that these Flemings all ended up on the same ship. It's hard to determine. We don't know if Eleanor Fleming then disembarked in Annapolis or crossed the Bay of Fundy in St. John. But Eleanor Fleming, whether she reunited with family on that ship or traveled alone, successfully escaped the Pugsleys in Sleepy Hollow and found her freedom in Canada. On July 12th and July 24th, 1783, the plight of Samuel Doran and his 2 children was heard by a committee made of British and American appointees. Brigadier General Birch worked with Washington's commissioners to interview and record information on every Black Loyalist who wanted to leave with the British. Black Loyalists, stated on page 2 of the Book of Negroes, it'll say here, and I'll read it because the script is kind of messy. Any person claiming property, embarked or to be embarked, will apply to any of these gentlemen who will call a board to examine into the merits of their claims. Should any doubts arrive on examination, the circumstances of the case are to be written down so as to furnish proper evidence to commissioners who may hereafter be appointed on both sides to adjust, settle all claims and controversies between the parties. The proceedings themselves became known as the Birch Trials, and it takes up the first few pages of the Book of Negroes, listing the various people that claimed ownership of somebody that was about ready to leave for Nova Scotia. The case of the father, Samuel Doran, was heard at Fraunces Tavern on July 12th. At the hearing, Samuel Doran, the Negro being desired to make his defense, says that in April of 1778, with consent of his mistress, went on board a galley, a ship, in order to come to New York. Now, Doran explains himself very well. His enslaver was a woman named Alida Teller. She leaned loyalist, but she lived in an area under American control in Upper Westchester. Doran stated that he left Teller's Point, which is the area where Teller lived, in northern Westchester, because he feared retribution from the local patriot population. So that's why he said he went south. The claimant who represented possession of Samuel Doran was Dr. Abraham Teller, the son of Alida Teller. Teller was asked one simple question from the Birch Trials. One question is all that he got, but it was a doozy. The claimant, being asked by Lieutenant Colonel Smith on the American commissioners, present whether now he considers himself a subject of Great Britain or the United States of America. And Teller answered that he considers himself a subject of the King of Britain. For Samuel Doran, Abraham Teller gave the wrong answer. The Dunmore and Philipsburg Proclamations both explicitly state that freedom would be granted only to enslaved individuals who run from a rebel enslaver, not from a British loyalist. So the Birch commissioners wrote their opinion here very simply. They are of the opinion that they are not authorized to determine the question between the claimant and the Negro, and referred the case to the proper authorities. Samuel Doran, however, was never entered into any embarkation records in the Book of Negroes because his enslaver or his claimant was a loyalist, not a rebel. So he doesn't get to go to Nova Scotia. The second part of Samuel Doran's case involved his 2 children, Peter and Elizabeth. They were not enslaved by Alida Teller, so their case was heard separately 10 days later, 12 days later on July 24th. The man claiming possession of the children was none other than Gerard G. Beekman IV, husband of Cornelia Van Cortlandt, one of the wealthiest American patriot families in New York. According to the transcripts of the Birch trial, we learn that Peter and Elizabeth had embarked, let me see if I can get that, had embarked with their father to go to Nova Scotia and were brought on shore for examination. So they were already on the boat. They were already getting ready to set sail to Nova Scotia when authorities came on board and took them back for the hearing. Mr. Beekman claimed that the two children belonged to his wife, Cornelia Van Cortlandt Beekman. And that happened when her father, Pierre Van Cortlandt, gave the unnamed mother of those two children to Cornelia in 1777. According to the trial transcript, upon examination, this is what they have to say here, upon examination, it appears that Samuel Doran, the father of the children, in April 1778, took them from the house of the said Pierre Van Cortlandt and brought them to the city of New York, where they have remained ever since. The commissioners hearing the case issued a very terse, one-sentence opinion, and that read very simply, "The board are of the opinion that the children ought to be delivered to the claimant, and he is hereby permitted to take and dispose of them as he may think proper." So Samuel Doran, he sent with his enslaver's son, Dr. Teller. Peter and Elizabeth, the children, were separated from their father and given to Gerard Beekman and his wife, Cornelia Van Cortlandt Beekman. And it's unclear, frankly, what claims the Beekmans actually had on the two children. Because both families, the Beekmans and the Van Cortlandts, sided strongly with the Patriot cause, and the Philipsburg Proclamation promised freedom to any enslaved person who ran from a rebel. Beekman served in the Westchester 3rd Regiment of New York. His father-in-law, this guy, Pierre Van Cortlandt Sr., was the current lieutenant governor of the state of New York at that time. So although Doran lost his chance at freedom because of the claimant's loyalty to Great Britain, why were his children returned to a family so deeply rooted in the patriotic or rebel cause? I don't know, is my answer, but I will be happy to posit a couple of questions to this. First of all, my first question about this, how old were Peter and Elizabeth as children? If they were very young, perhaps Doran or the Birch Board thought it best to return the children to their mother, who presumably remained with Cornelia Van Cortlandt, or they end up going to Nova Scotia as two young kids. Who takes care of them? Or, how powerful were the enslavers? The Beekmans and the Van Cortlandts. Their families were like American royalty, if you pardon the oxymoron there. Could they have simply been too influential and in a position to cause too much trouble to the British forces who have already surrendered and were evacuating their presence in the new nation? I don't know. But the Doran case serves to inform us that despite the good intentions of Guy Carleton and Samuel Birch to honor the promises made by the Dunmore and Philipsburg Proclamations, freedom was never guaranteed for anybody. Our third person in this story, Harry Washington, well, he left George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation in 1776 to join Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. And less than a month later, Harry Washington ends up sailing to New York City with Dunmore and 200 to 300 other members of that regiment. In New York, the remnants of Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment were formed into a group known as the Black Pioneers. Harry Washington worked for the Royal Artillery Department, accompanying British forces during their invasion of South Carolina and the occupation of Charleston. He served as a corporal in the Black Pioneers, and by late 1781, Harry Washington was back in New York City as well. His entry in the Book of Negroes is brief but telling. On July 31st, 1783, on board the ship L'Abondance, bound for Port Roseway, Nova Scotia, which has been renamed Shelburne, Harry Washington was listed as a stout fellow, aged 43 years old, and formerly the property of General Washington. Most importantly, the records here indicate that no claim was made against him. So uber patriot George Washington chose not to pursue action to have Harry returned to him, even though other patriots like the Beekmans did make that choice. Why? Because Washington raised quite a ruckus there, we saw with the letters between him and Guy Carleton about their differing interpretations of Article 7 of the peace treaty. So in addition to Harry, I want to even add that, two other enslaved persons belonging to General Washington were also recorded in the Book of Negroes. Deborah Squash, aged 20, and also Daniel Payne, aged 22. You can see them there. And then there's a third man named James Bartlett, or Bartlett, depending on how you read that. He's aged 59 and was noted in the book as being formerly enslaved by Colonel John Washington, George's younger brother. So 3 individuals. But Washington wasn't simply following orders of Congress to ensure that Great Britain returned confiscated property. This time it seems personal as to how many individuals are running from his property. And in his May 6th letter to Guy Carleton, Washington expressly stated that my private opinion is that the measure is totally different from the letter and spirit of the treaty. So why didn't he make a claim against these 4? Again, I don't know, because there's nothing there that tells me exactly why. I can again posit a couple of things out there. Perhaps the general's pride got in the way, and he decided he was not going to stoop to asking permission from the losing side to have Harry and the others return to him. Perhaps Washington was concerned that, unlike the Beekman claim, Birch would choose to make an example of George Washington and deny his claims because Washington's clearly a rebel, and the Dunmore Proclamation was clearly written against that. Or perhaps Washington thought that Harry is going to stir up more trouble at Mount Vernon if he was returned, and it was just best simply to be done with him. Harry Washington's story even continues beyond this. From his departure of New York City as a free man, he, in a few days, left New York City, and he disembarked at Shelburne on the southeastern coast of Nova Scotia. Of the 3,500 or so Black Loyalists taken to Canada in 1783, about 3,000 of them were settled between Birchtown and Shelburne, making it actually the largest free black community in the Western Hemisphere at that time. A half-mile down the coast from Shelburne is Birchtown, named after Samuel Birch. This area marks the epicenter of Black Loyalist settlement in Nova Scotia. While Shelburne was a mix of black and white Loyalists, Birchtown was almost exclusively black. It is also one of the rockiest and most unfit areas for agriculture in the colony of Nova Scotia. Harry Washington and the thousands of Black Loyalists who settled the region struggled to farm along the rock-strewn coastline. Winters were extremely harsh, food was scarce, and racial tensions ran high. Because remember, at this time, enslavement still existed and was legal in Canada. It had not been outlawed yet. So there were white Loyalists who settled on the best farmland, and they brought their enslaved laborers with them. So free Black Loyalists had to compete for work against racist policies and beliefs and unpaid slave labor as well. Many Black Loyalists were even denied the right to vote and never received their land that they were promised, and they ended up having to hire themselves out as day laborers. So Harry Washington and actually many other Black Loyalists grew quite frustrated over the inequities of life in Nova Scotia. Word of their difficulties reached London, and the growing abolitionist movement in London organized to resettle these Black Loyalists away from Canada, out of even places that they were settled in Jamaica and even in Great Britain, and they wanted to resettle them into a newly free colony of Sierra Leone. In 1792, Harry Washington joined 1,200 or so Black Loyalists and left Birchtown for Freetown, Sierra Leone. By 1800, a 60-year-old Harry Washington at this point had joined in a rebellion against Sierra Leone's colonial government. Like his former enslaver George Washington, Harry Washington was one of several hundred settlers who rose up against British rule. The issue is one taken straight out of the American Revolution playbook. The issue is taxation. The Sierra Leone Company, which ran the colony for the British government, required settlers to pay taxes for using their land. See, the land remained in the property of the company, so these settlers didn't own their own land. They just simply were renting it and paying taxes on it. And the rebels obviously preferred to own rather than rent their land and formed a provisional government of their own. The short-lived rebellion was quickly put down. Harry Washington was banished from the colony and exiled across the Sierra Leone River to a little place called Bullam Shore. Harry Washington, I keep saying between Harry and George here, but Harry Washington became one of the 2 leaders of a new settlement, but he died shortly thereafter of disease. His descendants, though, and those of the other Black Loyalists who went to Sierra Leone make up a significant portion of the Sierra Leone Creole population today. Now, although November 25th, 1783 became known as Evacuation Day here in New York, in fact, it was a holiday celebrated in New York City for more than a century, British Loyalists were actually still occupying parts of Staten Island and Long Island for at least another week after November 25th. The last exchange of letters between George Washington and Guy Carleton actually took place on the 1st of December, 1783. Carleton was on board his flagship just off the shore from Staten Island, and his short letter, I'll read the whole thing here, says, "Sir, if wind and weather permit, I hope we shall be able to embark the remainder of His Majesty's troops from Long Island and Staten Island and take our final departure on the 4th instant. I am, sir, your Excellency's most obedient and humble servant, Guy Carleton." That's the last letter that these two exchanged. Polite and courteous to the very end, Guy Carleton left New York for England in December of 1783. And 3 years later, he's back in North America as the Governor General of Canada. Now he is known as Lord Carleton, 1st Baron of Dorchester, and he remains Governor General of Canada for a decade, retiring in 1796 back to England and lived there until his death at age 84 in 1808. Carleton's colleagues described him as a somewhat inscrutable, cold, aloof, sour, and morose man, but also cool, intrepid, and incorruptible. He could at times be ruthless and vindictive, but also benevolent, honorable, humane, and just. Frederick North, he's the British Prime Minister through much of the American Revolution. He maintained that Carleton was so much of a soldier and so little of a politician, a resolute, honest man, and such a faithful and dutiful subject. So actually, much of what we say about Guy Carleton here is also said of his counterpart, George Washington. The two men were, in many ways, more alike, I think, than different. So, that kind of wraps up our story of Guy and George. We are welcome to take questions. We are welcome to talk about anything that didn't make sense. Yes, ma'am. John's actually going to have a microphone so the folks that are playing at home can hear as well.
Well, who settled in Yonkers?
Who settled in Yonkers? In terms of?
Well, we own a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she did the heritage on it, and it was Hutchison. What the history that I've been able to come up with so far is that Husted is one of the tenant names that you guys have downstairs. Her name has been on some of my house paperwork. My house was built in 1856, and then it was changed over again. The deed was updated in the 1900s, and my mother's bought this house back in, I think it was 1958. So we had a house fire there a few years ago, and when they started tearing the house down to redo it, we found gas lamps in the ceilings, and the flooring that you have downstairs, the wide plank flooring, that was throughout the whole house.
Wow.
But the house was originally, from what I'm gathering, there's 3 houses connected. It was one big house. And now I'm beginning to think it was a tenant house, one of these tenant farmer houses.
Tenant houses, there were, the Philipses owned some 50,000 acres of land here in Westchester, and all of Yonkers, or what Yonkers became. It wouldn't be surprising if the house dates back to pre-revolution that they would have been tenants of the Philipses, because the Philipses owned all the land around here and they would have been renting. The same way that Sherwood House, the Yonkers Historical Society, they were tenant farmers as well of the Philipses.
Right. So, it's very interesting, but it's hard to find stuff. You know, I went up to the records department in Elmsford, and I was up there quite a few days. And then I was down at the Yonkers Library quite a few days. But I've been told that a lot of the information has disappeared. Yeah,
the information disappears over the centuries because bugs eat paper and fires eat paper and all sorts of other problems happen over the centuries that documentation is lost.
Yeah.
So we use the best resources we can and fill in the blanks a little bit. I mean, if your family still remained, good chances are that they were patriots at the time of the war, because the Loyalists were not being allowed in many instances to buy back any of their land. Right. Some did, and some were able to, but people like the Philipses had to leave. They were forcibly removed and ended up in England because they were loyalists rather than patriots.
Yeah. So it's just very interesting. So I've been coming here trying to like fill in the pieces. Yeah.
That's what we do best. We try to
Yes.
fill in those blanks as best we can anyway.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions in the audience here?
Well, I can speak up loudly enough. I'm just wondering, the Sir Guy Carleton, is that the same name? Was he related to the British general in South Carolina that caused so much trouble?
Oh, Tarleton.
Oh, Tarleton.
Bannister
okay.
Tarleton was the
Oh,
guy down there.
okay.
Carleton was up in Canada, but he was fighting in a couple of places before he was made His Majesty's general.
Yeah, I recently read about his defense of Quebec,
Yeah.
and yeah, it was pretty.
I don't know if he so much won that battle or if disease is what lost it for the Americans.
Disease and the
bad
cold.
timing. Yeah.
I don't know why they chose that time of year.
All right, so we have some questions online here. First one is regards to Washington and Guy Carleton meeting over in Tapan. Why was Tapan chosen to meet to be the meeting place?
The letters aren't clear and they don't explicitly say why. Washington, I don't think, wanted Carleton or his men to be too close to Newburgh and where all the armies were up there in West Point and all that area. I think military secrets and such, you want to keep the enemy kind of, even though they were on the way of not being enemies, but they were still technically at war. So they chose a sort of an area kind of halfway between New York City and Newburgh, and Tapan kind of fit the bill for that.
Interesting. Wonder if it had anything to do with Major Andre. This is where we hanged your man. But another one here. Why was the transportation to Nova Scotia provided to to loyalists in New York City free, or did people need to come up with money to pay for that passage?
That's an interesting question that I have not been able to find an answer to. Because there's been no mention that these loyalists who are being evacuated had any obligations to pay for their transportation, it seems like it's being provided by the British government. The British government, however, were scraping to find enough ships to evacuate 20, 30, 40,000 soldiers and loyalists out of both New York City and Charleston and a couple of other places as well. So it was a huge endeavor, and Washington was convinced that Carleton was stalling and slowing down the process, but Carleton seemed to be saying, listen, I can't control the weather, and I can't control how many ships I have available at any given moment to take people away. I'm working as best I can, and your delegates that are here in New York City will back me up on this. That was not one of the letters I contained, but it seems to be one of the arguments made that this was just a big operation to get people out of these cities.
All right, and then based on what you had said, enslaved people not covered by the two proclamations, Dunmore and Philipsburg, were not eligible to go to Canada. Is there any estimation of how many people that entails?
There have been historians that have spanned the numbers of individuals who tried to self-liberate, anywhere from 20 to 80,000. Some have even estimated 100,000 people ran from their enslavers during the war. War produces chaos, and chaos produces opportunity when you're trying to find a way out. So if the British government, under Samuel Birch, conclude that you did run from a rebel, then they would do everything they could to get you out of the new United States of America and into freedom, either in Nova Scotia or even, as I mentioned earlier, Jamaica and some other of the islands too. But if they thought that you had belonged to a loyalist, they were not going to do that for you, because these guys weren't doing this out of the kindness of their heart in general. The British owned slaves as well. They were doing this to mess up the American economy and to hurt America as best they could. And one of the ways to do that is to arm your slaves and have a fight against them. So they were diligent in what they were doing. I think the Book of Negroes is a very accurate accounting of who actually made it out of New York. But there were thousands and thousands of others that didn't make it out, that ran and either got caught or returned, or had family that they found and left in another place. But it was a huge and difficult endeavor for those that chose to run and didn't make it to freedom.
All right, then I think we've got one more on here. Is it correct that women and children were not covered by Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and so therefore families could have been torn apart as a result of Dunmore's proclamation?
Yes. Dunmore's proclamation was explicit that it said men who could bear arms and take up those arms against the rebels. So that meant only men, and only men of fighting age. If you were too young or too old, you wouldn't be allowed either. So that is one of the clauses in the Dunmore Proclamation that did split families apart. Now, 3-4 years later, when the Philipsburg Proclamation is issued, it erases all of that, and it says anybody who can find their way to British-occupied territory would be freed. So within those 3 or 4 years between Dunmore's proclamation and the Philipsburg Proclamation, I am sure that families were torn apart. And there were families that actually still ran in spite of Dunmore's clause. So we do know that there were runaway ads in Virginia that did list entire families that tried to run as well. Sometimes those families would be considered sort of camp followers. And so they would help with the cooking and the cleaning and the laundering and all of that were necessary for any regiment to have. So sometimes families were able to stay together, but in many cases that was not the case. That's it? Well, folks, thank you so much for being here tonight. A couple of other things to point out. We have events going on all the time on this site. In another couple of weeks on Juneteenth, on June 19th, we are presenting an afternoon lecture series, because it's June 19th, people have the day off, called Black-Owned Farms in Early Westchester. And our very own Keith Doherty, who's been doing tremendous amounts of research on black-owned farms here in colonial and in 19th century New York, is going to present on that. It'll be right here. It's at 2 p.m. on Friday the 19th of June. So you can also check us out on philipsmanorhall.com. Our events page is on there. And there's a waterfront walking tour going on this Saturday, right, June 13th. All right, a couple of days from now at 10:30 a.m. It's a 1.5 mile walk around the waterfront and tremendous amount of history here in Yonkers. And so we love doing the walking tours and getting people interested in what they see out there in Yonkers. So check us out online. We're happy to have you come back, come in for a tour, come in for a walk, a talk, a chat. We'll do anything. Thanks so much for having us. Take care.